Hello historians, and welcome back to another episode. Today we are continuing our deep dive into the life of King Henry VIII and his reign. This time focusing on the later half of 1540 all the way through to 1542. It's clear to say that at this point in his life, King Henry VIII is probably the happiest he has been since his son Edward's birth. He has just had the easiest divorce in his life from Anne of Cleves, who he gave the honorary title of the King's sister, and he was passionately in love with young Catherine Howard. Catherine and her ladies were practicing dancing when the King's guards came to arrest her. Catherine, who had more pressing things on her mind than her romps with Manox and Derham years ago, demanded to know why she had been confined, but the guards would not enlighten her. Catherine had a hunch, and in the days to come, the knowledge prevented her from eating and sleeping. On the 5th of November 1541, Cranmer and the council told the king that they believed the allegations against the Queen had a sound basis. Cranmer actually didn't have any evidence beyond his own logic and that of the Lassells. Henry slumped into his chair, heartbroken, and wouldn't speak. Then he cried in front of the council. When Henry initially found out about Derham and Manox, he calmed down after the initial rage and seemed to be tempted to be merciful. But it was Culpeper that was the final straw, as Catherine's antics with Culpeper had happened during their marriage. Foolishly, Catherine had written what seemed like love letters and sent him gifts, and worse still, with the help of her Lady Rochford, Catherine had allowed Culpeper into her bedchamber while on the northern tour with her husband. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, was the only family member present when Catherine was informed of her charges and witnessed her hysterical reaction. Norfolk told Marillac that she was weeping like a madwoman, so that they must take away things by which she might hasten her death. Lady Rochford, who was guilty in abetting the Queen, suffered a bout of madness. It was thought by many that the two women would suffer the same fate, as they were confined together. Before Henry left Hampton Court, Catherine dashed past the guards and tried to reach him while he was at prayer in the Chapel Royal, but she was caught and dragged screaming back to her rooms. This corridor is known as the Haunted Gallery, and it is rumoured that Catherine's ghost reenacts her capture in that corridor. Cranmer visited Catherine Howard in her apartments in hopes of getting a confession from her. The once bright and cheery Catherine was melancholy and had moments of frenziness. It was clear that Catherine was not in the right state to be interrogated, so Cranmer came back the next day, but she was still quite frenzied. Cranmer was shaken by her behaviour and feared for her sanity. He read a letter from the king that promised her mercy if she confessed her faults. Catherine, under the impression that Henry was trying to deal with her gently, calmed. She then thanked the king for his grace and mercy and became more temperate and moderate, even though she did not stop crying, and when her panic hit her once more, she started to scream. Catherine insisted that she did not consent to her actions with Derham. When Catherine and Derham had been interacting back at the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk's house, they referred to each other as husband and wife, something that should only be done if you intend to marry each other, and therefore the two would have been seen as pre-contracted to each other. Catherine denied this to Cranmer and claimed it was common gossip, but she was too naive to realise that by admitting to the pre-contract with Derham, her life might have been spared, as lawfully she would never have been the king's wife, and therefore she could not be accused of adultery, the very thing that Cranmer was trying to prove. Catherine divulged to Cranmer her interactions with Derham and how he half lain with me, sometimes in his doublet and hose, and 2 or 3 times naked. Catherine then mentioned how Derham had heard a rumour that she was going to marry her cousin, Thomas Culpeper. When asked if it was true, she denied it, saying, "What should you trouble me thereabouts? For you know I will not have you. And if you heard such report, you know more than I." Catherine's big mistake was mentioning Culpeper. Culpeper was at court and a gentleman in the king's privy chamber. Catherine had always been fond of Culpeper. Cranmer did not know of this, but he was suspicious, and so he convinced the council to arrest and detain Culpeper for questioning. On the 7th of November 1541, Cranmer sent the Queen's written confession to the King, along with a further statement alleging that Derham had forced himself on Catherine. Catherine then also wrote a separate plea. Henry read the plea and was cheered because his beloved wife had not been unfaithful to him, and Manox and Derham had occurred prior to the marriage. Henry was informed of the pre-contract and was fine with an annulment. Henry returned to Hampton Court Palace and he socialised with the ladies. Marillac, the French ambassador, noted on how happy he looked. Rumours spread that Henry would take back Anne of Cleves, which King Francis I was in support of, as he had allied himself with the German princes and had hoped to create support against the Spanish emperor. However, Cranmer had not yet questioned Derham or Culpeper. The Queen was instructed to leave all of her lavish clothes and jewels at Hampton Court, and she was escorted to Sion Abbey, which had just been vacated by Lady Margaret Douglas. Catherine's lady, Catherine Tilney, was questioned next. Tilney told how, while on the Northern Progress, the Queen would frequently go to Lady Rochford's room, and Tilney would have to carry messages from the Queen to Lady Rochford that were so strange that she could not tell how to utter them. The council then summoned Margaret Morton, another of the Queen's ladies, to corroborate Tilney's story, which it did, but Margaret dropped in the name Thomas Culpeper. With Culpeper's name arising twice now, the council searched his belongings and they found a badly spelt letter signed from the Queen. I mean, don't forget, Catherine didn't have a great education. She was actually barely literate. It said, "Master Culpeper, I heartily recommend me unto you, praying you to send me word how that you do. I did hear that ye were sick, and I never longed for anything so much as to see you. It maketh me heart to die when I do think, and I cannot always be in your company. Come to me when Lady Rochford be here, for then I shall be best at leisure, to be at your commandment, and thus I take my leave of you, trusting to see you shortly again, and I would you were with me now, that you might see what pain I take in writing to you. Yours as long as life endures, Catherine." Catherine's letter was the most damning evidence against her, and it supported the accounts of both Morton and Tilney. Lady Rochford was then interrogated, followed by Culpeper. The Duke of Norfolk had abandoned his niece at the slightest bit of trouble, and told Marillac that she had prostituted herself to 7 or 8 persons. Norfolk was publicly shaming his niece to distance himself from her, just in case anyone remembered that it was his idea to try and set her up with the king. Henry now knew the worst, that Catherine had cheated on him with Culpeper. Despite the heartbreak, he took the news calmly. Catherine was stripped of her title of Queen in the late November of 1541. I want to say around the 23rd. I have in my notes the 22nd, but I've also got the 24th written down. And then when I've checked online, they've also said the 23rd. So it was either the 22nd, 23rd or 24th. Culpeper and Derham were tried by the Privy Council on the 1st of December. They were tried together and then later executed together on the 10th of December, 1541. Culpeper was first. No block was provided. He knelt on the ground by the gallows. Derham was hung, drawn and quartered, and both men had their heads set upon spikes on London Bridge. Marillac, the French ambassador, wrote to King Francis I prior to their execution and said he thought that Culpeper deserved to die. He noted that it seemed that the king would not be merciful for his wife, as he had changed his love for the Queen into hatred and taken such grief at being deceived that of late it was thought he'd gone mad. On one occasion, the king had called for a sword to slay her he had loved so much, and that sometimes he would say he would have delight in her death. Members of the Howard family were arrested in the middle of December and taken to the Tower of London. The Duke of Norfolk wrote to the king, pleading to save his own skin, and abandoned his family, going as far to say that he was sure that the arrests were justified, but after the abominable deeds done by my two nieces, here he's referring to Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, I fear your majesty will be abhorrent to hear speak of me or my kin again. Henry was angry with all of the Howards, especially the Duke of Norfolk, and he had not forgotten how it was he that pushed for the relationships with both Anne and Catherine. Both Catherine Howard and Jane, Lady Rochford, had shown signs of insanity while in the Tower, although Jane had it much worse than Catherine. On the 7th of February 1542, Henry passed a bill of attainder against both of the women, and he changed the law. It had once been illegal to execute the insane. Henry had changed the law prior to Catherine and Jane's execution, so he could execute them. Unlike George and Anne Boleyn, Catherine and Jane were denied a trial. Catherine learnt of her fate on the 10th of February 1542 while at Sion Abbey. The calm she had been exerting turned into blind panic, realising that Henry intended to have her executed. She refused to go, but she was forced into a barge that would take her to the Tower of London, all the while shrieking. Fortunately, her barge was enclosed, so she didn't see the rotting heads of Derham and Culpeper that was still on Tower Bridge. Catherine was wearing a black velvet dress and sat with 4 of her ladies and 4 members of the Privy Council. Catherine was told of her execution date on the 12th of February 1542, so she asked for a block to be brought to her room as she was concerned about making a good impression and wanted to look dignified. The strange request was granted, and she spent the night practicing how to lay her head on the block. The next day, Catherine was taken to Tower Green. She appeared weak to the point that she could hardly stand or speak. She asked all Christian people to take regard unto her worthy and just punishment with death, for her offences against God, heinously from her youth upward in breaking of all his commandments, and also against the King's royal majesty very dangerously. Her head was severed with one blow. Lady Rochford was next. According to Chapuis, she was still in a frenzy. Yet when faced with the axe and the Queen's blood-soaked remains being wrapped in a black blanket, she pulled herself together enough to make a speech. Then she too was gone. Catherine's remains were put in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula near her cousin Anne Boleyn. Catherine had been stripped of her title as queen, but her and Henry's marriage had never been annulled, and so Henry became a widower on the 13th of February 1542.
Where'd it tick? That means I'm single again! Oh, behave! Yeah!
Henry was in no rush for another wife, and he firmly told the Duke of Cleves that a reconciliation between him and Anne would never happen. Instead, he focused on marriages for his children. Elizabeth was badly affected by Catherine's death. She seemed to have got on with her stepmother, unlike her sister, and reportedly stated there and then that she would never marry. It's understandable when you look at marriage through her eyes. So far in her life, marriage seemed to be associated with death. Mary, on the other hand, hardly flinched at the news. After all, she'd already seen her father behead his stepmother, and she didn't like that one either. I'm sorry that this video had to be in 2 parts, but even when writing this, I feel like I could have gone even deeper, especially with Catherine and her antics at the Dowager Duchess's household. Catherine Howard, like Anne Boleyn for me, is someone who I could talk about for ages. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, leave a like, subscribe, and maybe watch another one. But until the next one, have a wonderful day.